Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Manager of Webinars for Tech Channel, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You may ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us, and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of the slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the left side of your screen. And know that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Fortra. Our featured speaker today is Sandi Moore, Principal Security Consultant at Fortra. Sandi has been working with Fortra customers for almost 20 years, helping them to effectively address systems monitoring and cybersecurity challenges on the IBM. Organizations throughout the public and private sector rely on Sandi's expertise, whether they're looking to proactively protect their systems or improve security controls after a malware attack. And so with that, Sandi, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Great. Thanks, Janine. All right. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. Hopefully, we'll be able to share some good information with you. Today, this is brought to you by Fortra and the new face of health systems, where we've long been known for helping organizations become more secure and autonomous. But as we've seen cyber threats evolve, so have we. And we are really focused on our tenacious pursuit of a better future for cybersecurity. With that, we're going to focus today on IBM and building out a good foundation of security defense. You always kind of wonder why we actually talk about security with IBM, because the system itself has always had a reputation of being one of the most secure operating systems on the market. And one of the reasons that it has that reputation is because IBM has been telling us this for years and really driving home that the system has a robust architecture and exceptional security. I'm a huge fan of IBM. I absolutely love the platform. I think it's great. But what I think what has happened is that we've been misled a little bit. The system itself is not secure by design. It is more of a better way to say it is a secureable operating system. And really, the system itself, that security functionality, has some assembly that needs to be actually put into place. So by default, as the system is shipped, it's not secure. So there are definitely some actions that have to be taken. Now, the reason I know that we need to take action on this is that Fortra sponsors an IBM State of IBM security study every year. And this annual study is built with security statistics taken from customer systems who we've collected anonymous data from using our security scan tool. And what it's done is it's given us a picture of what IBM shops are currently doing with those security controls and if they are actually enabling them. And unfortunately, year after year, we do see that there's room for improvement. And with that, we feel that there's definitely some things that need to happen. And we encourage customers to take a good look at what they're doing and then decide what their next steps are. Build out a plan and determine really what it needs to be done to actually get that system to that more secure state. But before we really get started talking about that, I actually want to get a poll, get some ideas from you guys, really what's happening with your IBM security projects. If you're actually working on projects, you're attending a security webinar, so it seems to be that there is probably some projects happening, that there's been some conversation around security on the system. So I really want to get a feel for what everybody's working on. It'll give us some ideas on exactly how things are rolling for you. So whether you're looking at beefing up your malware and ransomware protection on the system, maybe securing TCP/IP interfaces, such as FTP, ODBC, and so forth. Maybe you're looking at integrating your IBM security data into your SIEM and using a syslog solution to actually integrate all of that. From a more cohesive overall security operations center. Or maybe you're dealing with cybersecurity or cyber insurance requirements, and that's something we hear pop up quite a bit. Or maybe you just don't know, that you're not really in the loop on that, or you're not sure if you guys have any projects per se going for the year. So it really kind of depends on what role you play at your company as to what your involvement might be in these projects. Sometimes it's a bigger scope and you're not sure if the IBMI is actually part of that project scope.
All right, Sandy, I'm going to go ahead and launch these results to the audience.
Perfect. Yeah, it looks like malware and ransomware protection is high there, along with securing the TCP interfaces, and a few people that are looking at maybe SIM and dealing with cyber insurance requirements. So, awesome. Yep, always some good stuff going on, and it's a matter of really deciding, how you're going to tackle it. With that said, I actually have some ideas for you guys. So when we're looking at security projects, we really want to start thinking about what are the basics. And so through the process of doing these security scan reviews that I do with customers with our security scan tool, is that there's always some basic things that come out of it. And people always ask me, what should I be doing? And there is a foundational principle behind this that every system needs. So, when you start looking at it, you'd want to make sure that everything starts with a solid foundation. You don't want it to be your house of cards. You don't want the system to be the thing that brings down the company. So you have to take a step back, figure out what are the basics and what do you need to do first. The systems, these don't become unsecure overnight. These systems have been around for many customers, even 30 years, where things have just been propagated over and over again, and the security really is fallen short, whether it's neglected, ignored, or don't even realize that you need to do something. I have to warn you, though, there's no quick fix or shortcut. Security should not be a quick fix. Any commercial tools can assist with security, but if anybody tells you that this is going to solve all the problems, I would be very cautious. So I want to go through and actually talk about the steps and the things that I think are really your foundations and the things that should be done on every server. First, of course, think about what you've already done. So you're going to have perimeter controls already. Everybody tells me, well, my IBMI is behind a firewall. Of course it is. You'd be crazy not to have it behind a firewall. You might have a hole poked through that firewall for it to be available and then some alternative ways, but you have those perimeter controls in place. You have workstation controls in place, so all your workstations should be protected. And then you've granted users access to the system. So those things have already been done. Those are givens, and I expect this. This really, next steps are really about what comes after that. First and foremost is system configuration. So foundation one, and really just figuring out what the low-hanging fruit is, and then also developing a long-term plan. For your immediate steps on system configuration, my recommendation is to focus on turning on auditing, strengthening your user profile security, as well as reviewing your IFS shares. These are a big deal. So if you had a couple of quick fixes, and I say quick with tongue-in-cheek because there's nothing quick with it, but it should be the things that are easier for you to implement. Turning on auditing, this is going to give you visibility to what's happening on your server. Determine if you have the audit log configured first. You should have a QAudJourn, audit journal, and then make sure that your audit controls are actually set correctly. So make sure that the correct auditing is turned on so that you have the data that you need in the event of a suspected breach. With that said, if you have high availability software, double check to see what your auditing is actually set to, because when your auditing is configured for replication, very often they don't turn on the things that are important to security because password failures, system value changes, those kinds of things are not necessarily going to replicate, so they're not turned on. The other part of that is that with replication is they don't need it for very long. So you have to look at how long you're keeping that data. So making sure that that archiving and retention of that audit data is done with the thought of security. And if I suspect there's a breach, can I find that audit data to go back and look to see what happened? So establish a policy around how you're collecting the data, alerting on it. So not only should you be collecting it, but you also need to know what's actually going into that audit log. So if you never actually look in there, you're not seeing what's happening. It can be really important to know, has somebody created a new all object profile that has access to the entire database, the crown jewels of the company, and have they modified that for some reason? Those are the kinds of things you need to be able to see. Strengthening your user profile security. So you've given users access to the system. Very often they get this access on the very first day they're employed, and you don't even know them yet. So there can be some concerns around those user profiles. This is the access to the system, whether they have the access or somebody else is taking advantage of their credentials and accessing the system. So a couple of things here for low-hanging fruit: disable or delete unused user profiles. So if you have an empty desk, empty chair, but there's a user profile associated with that particular job, and it is still enabled, it is a threat to the system. Someone can take advantage of it and use that profile, and you don't even know who it is because that user is not technically working for you anymore. So it is good practice to make sure that you're automatically disabling profiles after they have been dormant for a number of days that you determine appropriate for you in your environment, and then eventually make sure that you're deleting those unused user profiles, not leaving them on the system to be potentially taken advantage of. Make sure you remove default passwords. So a common practice, unfortunate common practice, is to have default passwords on the system. So when you create a user profile is used as the password as well. And that is 101 for a threat actor. They figure out credentials. The first thing they're going to do is try to use that username as the password. So you can use the analyze default password command to run a report to determine if you have default passwords on the system. And make sure that you clean those up. Set those users' passwords to a different password, or set them to expire so the user's forced to change it the next time they sign on. But never good practice to leave those on the system. And remove command line authority. So this is another thing where you can have some real quick results of making sure somebody can't execute commands on the green screen. And so by setting that limit capability yes, you've taken away that threat. And it is sometimes something you don't realize. A user can actually still use it even if they have a menu on that green screen that does not have a command line on it. The user can force errors and eventually end up on a command line. So you can run a print user profile report and look for that limit capability setting, and really looking for that limit capability yes. So there's over 2,000 commands on the system, and we want to make sure that the average user is not able to use any of those that would be inappropriate. Last of your low-hanging fruit is to review your IFS shares. So the integrated file system has a nasty habit of being shared a lot. And so what happens is shares are created at the beginning of time, and then nobody goes back to double check to see what is out there. So you want to make sure that you review and eliminate any unnecessary shares on the system. If it's something that was done for a single project and nobody's using it anymore, don't leave it there. Especially if it's a read-write share, because this is going to expose whatever's in that directory to potential threats. Never share your root directory. I do see this many times where the root directory is shared, somebody's using it, then they're not using it, but it's still allowed, and that becomes the attack vector. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in when we start talking about the second layer of defense. But that root share is definitely an exposure. The entire operating system is exposed. If you look under the root directory, qsys.lib is there. And it can be secured so that it's not available to that root share with the QPWFS server authorization list. And we do highly recommend that you do that as well. But eliminating root shares is ideally the direction you want to go there. And if you do have shares you can't get rid of, consider setting them to read only so that the system itself is not compromised. If you have sensitive data in those shares, they are still read, which is an exposure, but at least it eliminates the potential for that IFS folders and files to be damaged. So quick low-hanging fruit there to be able to get some quick security measures in place. Long-term plan is to really start looking at the other vulnerabilities on the system. I just highlighted a couple of things, some quick actions for you, but you can do an in-depth risk assessment with our security services team to uncover any other security vulnerabilities and get a full in-depth evaluation of where there may be other threats on the system and other less than ideal configurations. Work with them to design and re-architect an application security scheme. So changing the object level authorities on your system can be very complex, and you have to be very careful with it. Our security services team does this every day. This is their job to do security on the system, so this is really where they're going to shine. And whereas you may have to go spend hours trying to figure out how to make a single change, this is something that they do all the time. So the ability to implement that new security architecture you come up with to ensure that the system is protected. Taking that full data security lifecycle and assisting you with that. Virus protection is layer 2. So again, these are the standards. This is at every system that I look at, and I've evaluated through our security scan. I've looked at probably 1,000 systems at this point, and with those, these are still the foundations that we recommend. Every server needs to have these things considered. Native virus scanning and ransomware protection. You know, people always say, well, power systems can't be infected, so why are we even having this conversation? Unfortunately, it is not the case. Traditional programs cannot be infected with a traditional virus. So if we're thinking of Windows viruses, those RPG programs, et cetera, are not going to be infected by that sense. However, with that, we've taken that and interpreted it as there's no virus possible on the IBM I. And IBM never actually told us that it was immune. They actually realized that it is in fact a problem, and they created the infrastructure going all the way back to 2004 to give integrated antivirus controls. So native virus scanning is something that was recognized as a problem. I will actually argue that, in fact, a traditional virus that we think of can be technically created on within the native objects as well. And that's a debate that some people have had, but if I wrote a program that is doing something that you did not intend for me to do, and it is doing something malicious, that's a malicious software program. So it is absolutely something that we have to consider. But when we're talking about the IFS, this is really where we're focused. And this integrated antivirus controls do give us the ability to scan the system. You just have to have a scan engine to actually do that part of it. Now, of course, proof is always in the pudding, so having visual evidence of said infections is, of course, helpful. And so we have seen many systems. There have been systems with Trojan horse programs dropped onto them into a whole host of directories in the IFS. Going back to those shares we talked about, those shares, whatever is shared, is potentially vulnerable to viruses, whether it is an auto-run worm, Trojan horse program, or if it's actually ransomware. And ransomware does hit power. We've seen it hit power over and over, and when it does, it can be extremely devastating to an institution where their system is no longer available and damaged beyond reasonable repair. So whether you're the customer who got hit by and ended up with 500,000 files encrypted by that ransomware, 250,000 copies of that ransomware dropped onto their server, or the customer who had got hit by ransomware on their development system and didn't notice it for almost 2 weeks, and with 400,000 files encrypted by ransomware. So the impact can be broad. It really depends on what is shared as to what is going to be impacted by those types of attacks. Now, of course, you have to consider really why this is going to happen. So your data is valuable. The system is valuable. Typically, the IBMI is where the core data is on for the company, and you're going to need to ensure that it is safe. The couple different reasons why that data is valuable to the threat actors. They're going to be able to sell data on the dark web, so data theft is one driver behind it. Ransom, so we've all heard about that those ransomware attacks. They want money in order to get access to your data back. So really, that money drives a lot of things, and unfortunately, this is a big one. But sometimes it's also just about destruction of data, and whether it is intentional or just the fallout as one of the payloads of that particular attack. And I like to remind people, anyone and anything is a target. You may not think your company would be a target, but if you do business in the world, you are a potential target. And as far as the IBMI is concerned, it's just another server. So it is a target, it is in your environment, and if it's your core server, everybody's connecting to it, so it's going to gain some attention. So it has to be considered as a target, and that there is a real and present threat. We start considering how this is actually going to happen and how the IBMI can act as a source of virus problems on a network. So the IBMI is a very happy host to malware. It shows no symptoms. So you may actually have it stored on your server. I've seen viruses on the system for upwards of 20 years. And while most workstations are going to be able to handle that, if they do try to open one of those files, there's still that potential that one workstation has their protections disabled. And that is going to be the vulnerable system. It only takes one. It doesn't take all of them. Now, that virus activity can be propagated to the server through multitude of avenues, whether it's shared IFS directories, we've talked about that, map drives. So if the user's mapping drives, they've got this open, ready to go access to the system, and it can very easily migrate. But you don't have to actually map a drive to take advantage of a shared IFS directory in order for it to become a problem. If that share is discoverable, it can be impacted. But the IFS is not populated through those avenues alone. You've got FTP, you've got NFS mounts, restoring from backups. If you think you're restoring a clean copy of files after an attack and your backup had compromised data, how far would you have to go back? And high availability is very happy to replicate infections. So you have to consider really, how are the files being populated, how can they be updated, and how are they going to be protected? And of course, this is happening because even despite the fact that there is antivirus and protections deployed elsewhere in an environment, you'd never rely on a single layer of protection and only have a firewall, for example, to protect everything. Because those users have access to the outside world, it does unfortunately open up the ability for things to propagate. And because those deployments of other protections can have vulnerabilities and can be disabled, that malware can still reach your power servers. So those infections can still occur through zero-day exploits, failed virus signature updates, or deactivated or blocked virus engines. And think about that one computer in the mailroom or the break room that everybody uses to play games on during their lunch, or the one that you forget to update, or they've deactivated the scan engine because they were doing some testing. So those all create that open window for those to happen. Using native antivirus protections is going to provide a host of benefits. So you're going to have that full integration between the IBMI itself and the infrastructure that was created by IBM, including the exit points, the system values, as well as the attributes on those stream files. And so making that connection between the IBMI and the antivirus scan engine itself, the ability to use those stream file attributes. So every stream file on your system has an attribute for scanning and the last scan status, so that you can actually track and the operating system knows, hey, this file is okay, or this file was infected, it should not be used. Performance improvements through selective scanning, so being smart about it. If you're actually scanning a file, if it doesn't need to be scanned again, it can be skipped. But also really having that incremental real-time scanning. So users accessing the IFS through the file server, you want to make sure that either they're not spreading malware to the server through those read-write shares, or they're opening a file that's infected that's spreading to those end users' workstation. So having on-access scanning is critical to ensuring that you have broken that cycle from the IBMI and it's not part of an outbreak. And of course, being able to scan on demand as well. So being able to schedule a batch job that runs to scan the IFS to make sure that all those other ways that we're populating the IFS has not introduced malware onto the server. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that having malware on any server at any time is appropriate in any environment. So just because it's the IBMI doesn't mean it's okay for it to have malware on it. Now, Powertech Antivirus for IBMI can assist with all of this through our native antivirus. And so being able to actually scan those files as users open and close them, this is going to be able to provide you with the assurance that the system itself is not hosting that malware, that those workstations are not actually causing the system to become infected. We've seen crazy things with infections on user systems where files in the IFS are the source of infection. They don't think of it because when you open up the green screen, hey, why would I have an infection trigger on my PC? It's a green screen. But any graphical representation of your system is using the IFS. So you really have to consider where that's happening from. And of course, ransomware, biggest threat right now on for any organization. It's not if you're going to get hit by ransomware, it's when and how much is going to be damaged. So with the Powertech Antivirus enhanced anti-ransomware protection, we're actually able to monitor that traffic through the file server and watch for malicious access patterns by the users. So ensuring that if they are in fact the source of a ransomware attack and they're doing a programmatic read, rename, encrypt, and delete of your stream files, that we're going to block that attack and cut that user off from the file server. So effectively reducing the blast zone. How many files are compromised versus if this was allowed to continue until somebody discovered what was happening. So really about limiting how much impact there is on the system and ensuring that this part of it, the file server itself and the IFS, is not being crippled. And so really powerful in being able to have control over that. All right, so our third layer of defense that I recommend for every customer is exit program. So this is really giving you that auditing and access controls on the system. So there is a long-standing belief that the IBMI, of course, is great, secure, nobody can get in. So we have menu security that limits what applications and options the users can be able to access. We have application security itself that restricts the functions the user can perform when they're in that application. So this has really created an environment of security by obscurity where people don't understand necessarily the complexity of object level security. They know that if this user does exactly what you tell them to do, they can't do anything else. It is beneficial. If you're a primarily green screen environment, absolutely, you need to have these menu security and application controls in place, but they're not sufficiently comprehensive for today's environment. Your IBMI is connected to the network. Your users have access, whether you intend for them to or not. The fact that these interfaces that IBM provides are available and the user has a user ID and password and access to the system, unfortunately, these PC interfaces can actually circumvent that menu and application security. So instead of hitting that menu or that application control, they are actually able to get to whatever they have authority to on the system at the system level. So object level security is something that is not often undertaken. It is definitely a complex project. I already kind of mentioned that when we were talking about our security services team. And truly, there is no object on the system that a user would need to be able to access in all of the ways that are available on the system. Give them the one interface that they're supposed to use, and how do you prevent them from using the other interfaces? IBMI, unfortunately, doesn't give us a lot of ways to see who's using these optional PC interfaces and what they're doing with those. Now, because again, having visual examples of how this works, just some ideas for you on alternative ways that users may be able to see data on the system. So with ACS, for example, doing a data transfer from IBMI, being able to pull files into a display, into a file itself, into a spreadsheet. So really actually being able to take this information, pull it off to your PC, and then walk away with it. Not necessarily appropriate. So you want the user to use the interface you've provided for them and giving them access to the database, assuming that they're going to be using the application. And this is definitely something where it might not be appropriate. Or, we're going back to the IFS and the ability, if you have, users have access to the integrated file system, whether it's through a share or if it's through ACS, getting the ability to get to qsys.lib, you can go pull data off the system and download a file. And at that point, that data is exposed. So it's in a different format. That user needed to have access to the data, but not in the format that they necessarily are retrieving it in. Of course, those aren't the only ways. You've got FTP and the ability to get files off the system, and as well as running SQL scripts, so being able to pull that data and view it. So probably not what you would intend for a user when you gave them read access to a specific database. So unfortunately, the access is granted, they're going to have that ability. There's also alternative ways to modify that data. So whether you're using FTP and putting a file on the system, you're using data transfer to upload back to the system, or you're using the IFS options. If you have change authority, you're going to be able to do this. And unfortunately, because we don't have auditing built into the system of when these alternative interfaces are used, you don't know who made those changes, and it can be catastrophic. Someone who should be able to download the data, build a report, but not necessarily be able to upload a change to that report is going to potentially cause problems. And of course, alternative ways to maintain objects on the system. And I say maintain loosely, so whether they are doing a rename or if they're doing a delete, if they have that ability and they are not understanding where they are, or maybe they do know exactly what they're doing and they are doing something intentionally malicious. So again, this is all outside of your menu and application controls. So there is that exposure for things to be compromised and potentially damaged without even having that visibility to who did it. So using those exit programs to put a layer of control in place. So instead of letting those users have free access to those interfaces, actually building in custom functions so that when a user attempts to use one of those PC interfaces, you've got some ability to interrupt that connection and decide what to do next with that request. So think of it this way. Your IBMI is a building. This is your office building, and you have your front door. The telnet, that green screen, is your front door. You've got that covered. You know who's coming in and out, and you know what they're doing. Then you've got all these side doors. And this is really where those PC interfaces come in. Those are the side doors to your system. And you have no security cameras over those doors. You don't have any locks on the doors. Sometimes you don't even have a door on there. So really it's about how do you get that visibility to who's coming in through all of those side doors. So the next program, it can be written by a programmer to do pretty much anything that they want. It could be malicious, but really from a security perspective, we really are focused on having those exit programs do two things. So auditing, so having that visibility, the security camera above the door, where you can see who's coming into the door, who's going out the door, and what they're carrying with them when they go in and out. So really being able to know who is using those interfaces. You don't want to necessarily shut those down. They are valuable interfaces, but you want to make sure that you get to see who is actually taking advantage of it. And then, of course, the next step is to control it. And so this is really where you're going to be able to say, hey, Joe from accounting, he is allowed to use the PC interface for ODBC to pull data into a spreadsheet. But because he's in accounting, he's allowed to update data. But when he's coming through that particular interface, he can't do the update. So really being able to put the control. So someone comes in that side door. Yes, ma'am.
Janine interrupting because just on this slide, your phone started to break up. So it's kind of going in and out. So to correct that, would you mind dialing in really quick? Just hanging up and dialing back in. And while you do that, I'm going to remind, perfect. I'm going to remind everybody that you can download a PDF version of the slide deck. So while Sandy's dialing back in, check out Event Resources on the left side of your screen. Click on that little drop-down menu, and you can download those slides right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. And we should have Sandy back soon.
All right, Janine, can you hear me better?
Yes, that worked. Thank you, Sandy.
Perfect. All right. Sorry, guys. Don't know what happened there. Gotta love the internet providers. All right. So exit program controls. So really about having that visibility to what's happening on the system. So being able to audit what's happening, see who's coming in and out, all of those side doors to the system, but also then adding a layer of control. So really, exit program can return a pass-fail. So is the user going to be able to come in through the door or not? And what they're requesting to do, are they going to be able to do it or not? Now, a pass-fail, of course, is not going to override any OS security rules you have in place. So it's not going to allow extra things to happen, but it can give you additional controls. All right, so really, these PC interfaces are the most attacked interfaces, and unfortunately, they are the least guarded. And so exit programs are really critical to getting that control and really do create that last layer of defense. Think of it as the firewall for the IBMI. This is where it comes down to, this is how we see what's happening on the system, this is how we're going to be able to defend it. So preventing any unwanted access to the data on the system and preventing unwanted commands to be run on the system. So we initially talked about cleaning up your user profiles and securing those better and removing command line authority. Well, you can run commands through some of these PC interfaces and you would have no visibility without an exit program actually monitoring that. So in most cases, it's not appropriate for end users to run commands through any of those PC interfaces. So really something that you can get control over pretty quickly. You can still allow that approved access to your server. So allowing authorized activity to continue. So whitelisting approved access. And then, of course, being able to log what's happening and alert when there's unauthorized attempts made to connect to your system. And so really having that visibility to when that's happening is critical as well. So someone may not be able to get in, but the fact that they were trying is potentially just as alarming. We had a customer once who was actually doing a trial of our exit program software, and during that trial they had almost 1,000 rejected FTP attempts onto their server from a foreign IP address, and the user profiles that were being attempted were not even IBM profiles. So it was root, admin, user, user 1, 2, 3. So profiles that were Unix-based profiles. So the threat actor that was trying to get onto their server didn't even know it was an IBMI, but the fact that they were able to get to the server and actually attempt it, that alone was alarming. So really, it's important to be able to see what's happening and who's trying to get on your server and not assume that no one can get to it. So exit programs themselves, and how do you obtain those? So you can write your own. It is actually terrifying to think that some folks would write their own exit programs just because it is very complex. And if you're not just doing a block all traffic, then you really do have to ensure that you're not causing performance issues. Make sure that you're testing against every operating system release. I do work with customers who they say, yeah, we've got some exit programs. We have no idea what they do. Remember, these exit programs can do anything. So it could be something malicious. So it is a concern when, especially when people start retiring and that person was the only one who knew what that code was doing. It would be a concern for me. So using a commercial solution is going to give you more control, more purview, and it's going to be much more well accepted by auditors. So if you do in fact have compliance mandates, auditors are not going to be fond of your own people creating those controls internally because it's too easy for someone to make changes. So Powertech Exit Point Manager for IBMI is going to give you that full control over all of those critical PC interfaces. So having the visibility to who's using the file server, FTP server, ODBC, and many more, and the ability to whitelist authorized access, actually be able to see who's connecting to the system, grant them access to continue, and then eventually you really want to get to that deny by default. So making sure that users are not able to get in that you haven't explicitly authorized. And so having the audit trail to see who is doing it, what they're doing. You have administrators on your system. We trust the administrators, but we still need to see what they're doing to ensure that we know that what's being done is appropriate. So really being able to have that comprehensive reporting over it and the control over it, and the peace of mind that you know that you have full control over all of those side doors to your system. All right, so building our IBMI security foundation, really having that strong foundation, starting with the system configuration, ensuring that you've taken those steps. I'll give you some quick tips on that, some low-hanging fruit, so that you can start tackling that. Virus protection, of course, critical. You would never leave your PCs unprotected. Why would you leave your core server unprotected? And then exit program, so ensuring that you have that firewall around the system so that you don't have users who are taking advantage of the unmonitored connections to the system and being able to get in. So really establishing that solid foundation to make sure that the server itself, regardless of what you use it for, that it is protected and it is not going to be the weak point that is going to bring down the environment. All right, so what's your call to action today? So I really encourage you to really take a look at your risk on the system, and actually using our security scan for Powertech security scan is going to give you that high level overview. Think of this as your 30,000 foot view, where you're going to be able to look at a lot of those configurations and see where you're at compared to the foundations that we've talked about today, and have it in black and white in full color to be able to see exactly where you sit right now. So cool thing is, this is a free tool. It's non-intrusive, doesn't access application data, and we'll even spend an hour with you and review the results with you, so you really can get a good understanding of what we were looking for, why we flagged it as a high risk, and then really be able to guide you in what your next steps are, but also prioritizing. As I mentioned at the beginning, your system didn't get this way overnight. These user profiles may have been around for years and years, but you have to start somewhere. And so really using this is going to be able to get you started with that next step in your journey of securing your environment. You know, this is just one piece of it, and it can really go a long way for getting you the attention that you need to be able to get support for any security projects on the system. All right, Janine.
We're ready for some questions.
Let's get some questions here. So.
That's great. We do have some questions. Before we kick that off, I just want to let everyone know that that is a live link on the slide. So be sure to click on it just for more information, or if you're interested in that free security scan, it will open in a separate window for you and be available to you following the event. So be sure to take advantage of that. Okay, so our first question relates to something you discussed earlier in the presentation, and it's the native antivirus. So is a native antivirus something that's part of the operating system, or is it software that needs to be purchased?
Yeah, so native virus protection comes from software that would be purchased. IBM provided the infrastructure and the operating system to support it, but they really didn't want to get into the business of being an antivirus vendor. So they actually, interesting history story here is that IBM actually approached a company I worked for 20 years ago and asked us to partner up with Trellix, formerly known as McAfee, and to port over that scan engine and provide for that very first and only commercially available native antivirus solution. So the system itself doesn't have the virus protection, but it has the hooks into it. So the ability to track whether or not a file's been scanned, but it doesn't do the actual scanning.
Gotcha. Okay, the next question is, we don't use the IFS. Do we still need antivirus and all that?
I love this question. I always get fired up on this one. So funny thing is that you can't not use your IFS. So the IFS, the integrated file system, it actually, as I had talked about it earlier, is that the root directory, qsys.lib, is underneath it. So it is actually a not removable part of your operating system. So everybody uses it. If you have a graphical representation of anything on your system, it is using the IFS. Those graphics are stored there. So anything that you use that way, it does use the IFS. So you may not share it, but files are populated in the IFS. And it's not just the shares themselves. It's all of those other methods. So every server should have that. If you're only using it for a web server, why would you want to host malware out to your users who are accessing your website? So always good practice. It's always about layers and making sure that every layer possible is covered.
Great. Okay, I've tried to remove shares, but users complain. Any suggestions?
Oh, yeah. Users, people get used to having those shares, and, one of the things you can do is use the exit programs and monitor to see who's actually using it. And then you're better off giving private authorities to those shares for those specific users you can't get rid of, using the exit programs to control access and ensure that they're not actually causing problems. It's definitely a challenge. There at one point, even IBM was providing a share over IBM directory. So, you know, it is hard to back those out, but it is worth looking at to prevent the possible damage to the system, and even potentially changing it from a discoverable share to a non-discoverable share. That can prevent some unauthorized access as well.
Okay. All right. Seeing no more questions, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I also want to thank you, Sandi, for sharing your expertise with us today. So later this week, watch for a follow-up email. It will contain a link to the recording of today's webinar. Get all the latest on all things tech by going to techchannel.com/subscribe. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.